Hi there, welcome to today's Q&A live. My name's Rebecca and I'm here to answer questions you might have about preparing for OET. It's a very simple format. If you've never joined me for one of these sessions before, I'm here for the next 60 minutes to answer your questions live. So just adding into the screen the reminder to post your questions in the comment box, and this is available whether you're joining us live on Facebook or joining us live from our YouTube channel. So I can see that we've got nearly 250 candidates live with us at the moment, and over 100 candidates on both of our channels, actually very similar numbers on both channels. So it's great to see you. Hello to those on YouTube, hello to those on Facebook. And as I said, whatever your question is about preparing for OET, whether you've got your test coming up this month, next month, or a little bit further on into the future, I'm here to answer those questions. So I always have far too many questions to answer than I have time for. So don't be shy, post your comments into the chat, and I'm going to head there now to start working through them. So let's have a look. The first question I'm going to answer is this one from Arati, who says, are we supposed to write listening answers, in small letters or in block letters? So this is your preference. Essentially, both of those are accepted. It's up to you if you prefer to write everything in capital letters, but it's not mandatory. If you are comfortable writing in the normal mixture of upper and lowercase letters, small and larger letters, then that's absolutely fine as well. So both are accepted. This question coming through from Silpa on Facebook, is there a plan to change the current version of OET? No, Silpa, there's no plans for any changes to OET at the moment. As you know, we're making OET much more accessible at the moment, offering OET on paper, on computer, and also recently we've also started offering OET at home for candidates who don't have access to a physical venue in their country. So that's the only sort of update that we have at the moment, which is to make the test much more accessible. But across those different types of the test itself is the same. The format hasn't changed. The timing of the test hasn't changed. And there's no plans to make those sorts of changes going forward. Kashmir is asking whether I have any tips on writing for your second attempt at OET. So there are a number of things that I could talk about, but what I'm going to focus on is making sure that what you write is personalized to the situation that are in your case notes, to the patient that you're writing about. I think it's very easy when you're preparing for a test to try to follow a set formula or a template, which is what some candidates call it, which is essentially the same body of the letter, but they just remove details and swap in with what's in their case notes. That isn't actually the best way to approach OET writing. What you're demonstrating in OET writing, if you're aiming for one of the higher grades, is that you have flexibility with language, that you're able to demonstrate that you have a variety of vocabulary and grammar that will suit this particular situation. And so the way to demonstrate that is not to use template phrases or a formula to your letter, but think about the reader, the person receiving your letter, and organize the letter in a way that will make sense to the reader, that will prioritize the information the reader most wants, and to use language as well to coordinate and combine the information you need to communicate. So being personalized in your writing is a good tip and really a good way to make sure you score well in your test. Cynthia says, in the listening subtest, are you penalized for wrong spelling? So obviously in the listening test, you are writing your answers as you are listening, and that does lend itself to a degree of error with your spelling. However, at the end of the listening test, you are given some time to check your answers. And during that time, we would encourage you to check your spelling and to improve on it if you notice that you have made a spelling mistake. We are encouraging you to be as accurate as you can with your spelling. However, having said that, there is a degree of flexibility that the assessors are able to take with the spelling of your listening answers, particularly perhaps with something like if you've missed off an S on the end of a plural noun and the S isn't significant to changing the meaning of what you have written. But our encouragement would be to be as accurate as you can with your spelling to avoid any penalty there. Sabi is asking about, I've heard that there was a question leak from OET. Is that true? Does it affect the next test paper? So firstly, to reassure you, there's absolutely no impact on any subsequent or future test papers. OET maintains security in a very high sense for all of our test papers. And whereas there was an incident in one location, which is now being looked into, both in a legal sense and in a sense where any candidate that is found to have entered into cheating or by getting hold of a test paper that they didn't have the right to access before the test, they will have penalties taken against those. And we have communicated that with the area in question, with candidates and with our test venues. So you can be assured that OET takes security very seriously. And as per every test, we will be monitoring the next test to make sure that no further security breaches occur. So if you're taking a test that's coming up, you don't need to have any anxiety about any impact from the last test on your test. You can just go into that test to do the best that you can on test day. Thank you for that. Gladys says, what is the best pattern for studying OET for self-review? So really the best place to start if you're new to OET is to visit the OET website, which has recently been updated. We've got a new look there, and hopefully a lot of you have visited that to see the changes that we have made and the better design and layout to make it easier for candidates to find the information that they want. The best place to go is to the Prepare page. And on this page, we have a lot of self-review activities and resources for you to make use of. So that would be where I recommend you start. Ganesh says, in my last test, I performed well in writing, but I only got 280 marks. Could you help me whether remarking will help me to increase my score? So Ganesh, what happens for marking of a test paper, and this is true for all candidates, is that when you have taken OET, your papers are sent to OET assessors here in Melbourne in Australia. And 2 assessors score every test paper. That's for reading, writing, listening, and speaking. 2 assessors minimum are used to score every test paper. And it is the combination of those marks that is what leads to your final overall score. So by receiving a 280, that means that these 2 assessors both felt that your writing deserved that overall score of 280. And what that does mean is that if you go for remarking, another 2 assessors who don't know your previous score will do exactly the same thing. They will mark your paper using the exact same assessment criteria that the first 2 do. And so the likelihood is, because we use only one group of assessors that we train all of the same way, that these assessors in the remarking process will also find that your writing receives the same score. So it is your choice whether you want to go for remarking or not, but it's good to understand how that process works. And if in remarking you find that your result doesn't change, what that means is that 4 assessors have now agreed that that is your correct result. In computer testing, Emma has a question from Facebook. Are spelling errors in listening part A accepted? So this is the same. I answered the question earlier, and I suppose I didn't specify which of those papers it could be in. The advice is the same. You need to make sure that you haven't made any typing errors with your answers. You have time to check your answers at the end of each part of the test in the listening test on computer. So as much as possible, you definitely need to make sure your spelling is as accurate as possible. Neil is asking from YouTube, I got 300 plus score on speaking and listening and 250 plus on writing and reading. Can I combine my future results if I take OET again? So Neil, this is something that it's best to check with the regulator that you're hoping to apply to with your OET results. Each regulator has slightly different requirements. They allow results to be combined or not combined depending on your profession, and the minimum scores that they will allow when combining results. So I'm not sure which your regulator is, but do get in contact with them. Have a look on their website to find information about what their requirements are, and that should then answer your question. If I'm taking off, not that confident in terms of writing, what can you advise? So Evie, definitely go and check out those resources from our prepare page that I've posted in the comment box already. Also make the most of the live sessions that are being delivered by our Preparation All-Stars, our partners who are premium providers. They've gone through a lot of training with OET, and 3 or 4 times a week we have live classes going out from our All-Stars, and some of those cover writing. So make sure you're getting involved with those sessions. They're teacher-led and they can be really useful in giving you some tips and practice activities. And then I think the main thing with all parts of the test, but especially with writing, is to make sure that you do regular practice. Now, this doesn't always have to mean taking practice test papers. You can practice your writing without a particular practice test. Obviously, as you know, the writing test is based on writing a letter about a patient. Many of you are working currently as healthcare professionals, so you're coming across patients every day. You can choose one of the patients that you've been treating more recently. Think about the reason that you've been treating them, what their history was, what their future needs are, and you can easily turn that information into a writing task. And just by doing some of that regular practice, perhaps even every day, choosing to write about one of your patients, that's going to make a big difference in your fluency of writing, how comfortable you feel about writing about patients. Grace says, can we use as well as and in OET writing? So as connectors, you obviously are going to use the connector that works best for the sentence that you are writing. And is a very familiar, very common connector that of course can be used whenever it is required. As another connector can be used as well when it's the best option for the sentence that you're writing. We sometimes see as being overused as a connector in a not a very smart sense, particularly in the introduction paragraph. And often we find that there's a better alternative that is more descriptive and perhaps also more succinct, meaning you don't need so many words to write the same information in the sentence. So if you've got the best connector for your sentence and it's one of those words, then obviously use that. But just think about, is this the best connector? Do I need this connector? Can I write the sentence without that connector and it still make equal sense? Kailash says, can you give me some tips for reading Part A, please? So I think the main thing that candidates feel anxious about with reading Part A is the time factor. I'm pretty sure if OET extended how much time that was available for reading Part A, candidates would see that it's actually quite a straightforward part of the test. We're simply asking you to locate information given for you in one of 4 texts. Now, the reason that the time pressure is there is because when designing reading Part A, we research the skills that healthcare professionals need and that are valued in a healthcare professional by regulators and by employers. And they told us that it is good for them to know that potential candidates are able to quickly find information under a certain amount of time pressure, because they feel that is a skill that healthcare professionals need. And that's why we have a 15-minute time limit. But it doesn't mean that definitely sort of increases the challenge of the task. In fact, my recommendation for how to improve your score in reading Part A is actually from the beginning to remove that time pressure, actually learn how to do the task, what is required, how to find the answers, making sure that you're accurate with your answers. And once you can answer all of the questions correctly, then start reducing the time and working towards being able to do it within 15 minutes. Because I think what sometimes happens is that when candidates start preparing for reading Part A, they start doing it as if it's a real test. So with just the 15 minutes and with all of the questions. And that can mean your brain is struggling from 2 angles. It's struggling because it knows it's got a time pressure, and our brains don't really like being put under time pressure. But it's also struggling because it's trying to work out what it needs to do, how to answer these questions. So if you remove one of those pressures while you're preparing for OET, then your brain can relax. It can work out how to answer the questions. It can answer them accurately, and then it can cope better with the time pressure being added back in. All right, I'm going to skip forward a little bit to make sure I'm answering some of the more recent questions, because there's so many coming through. Let's have a look. This question from Jade: what if I was only able to write 140 words in the writing task, but I was able to include all of the pertinent information? Will there be a deduction for that? So Jade, in some ways, yes, that's absolutely fine. The main thing is that you have communicated all of the information that the reader requires to be able to continue to care for the patient. However, I would suggest, because of the way that OET writing tasks are designed, that they go through several layers of checks, and they need to be standardized to make sure that there's sufficient information for candidates to communicate within the 40 minutes, but also sufficient information to end up with a letter which is around 180 to 200 words long, because we need a decent amount of writing from you for the assessors to be able to assess it sufficiently to decide what score you get against each of the criteria. So my reservation would be that if you've only written 140 words, either you're practicing with some unofficial materials that just don't have enough information in there to write a long enough letter, or you have actually left out some of the information the reader would need, because I think it's very unlikely that an official practice test task could be completed in only 140 words. Rinsilla is asking, is a COVID test required to attend the test? This is a question to ask the test venue where you are registered to sit your test. I don't know the information for all of our test venues. I'm not aware that COVID tests are required, but obviously OET is following the requirements that are in place and set by local governments for each test venue. It could possibly be that there is such a requirement. So please ask the test venue that question. and they will let you know if there's any requirements that you need to follow. This question from YouTube, for the reference line, do we write the patient's name and then their age? So our recommendation is to think about the reference line as the piece of information that the reader will use to locate this patient in their database, in their files. They will type these details into the computer to find out information that they already have about this patient. So obviously a patient's name is something that could be looked up in a database. That would come up definitely with some results. But entering into a database someone's age is not something that you can search for. Our recommendation, therefore, is that you include the patient's date of birth in the reference line, not their age. Now, in official OET case notes, the date of birth is generally provided, so you can definitely do that for official practice tasks. In unofficial practice tasks, you may find that the date of birth isn't provided. And again, as I've just mentioned, you do need to be careful about using unofficial practice materials because they can mislead you. They can misrepresent the test. They can make you believe that the test is one way when in fact it's something different. So our advice is name and date of birth in the reference line. If the age is also provided in the case notes, then you can certainly include that within your introduction if you feel that that's relevant for the reader. But also to say about age, you're never expected to calculate the patient's age. So if the case notes only give you the patient's date of birth, include that in the reference line, but don't worry about calculating the age to include in the introduction. We're not expecting you to make that kind of calculation in the test. Ninu is asking, is it needed to mention I am writing on behalf of? Now, this is another example. So this is the third example that I'm mentioning in a very short space of time where I believe candidates are working with unofficial practice materials for OET. Officially, OET do not ask candidates to write a letter on behalf of the patient or a family member. So if you are seeing practice tests circulating online through social media groups that are asking you to write a letter on behalf of somebody else, that's a very good sign that it's not a good quality material. It's not something that would be expected of you by OET. So I think after mentioning these things 3 times, my advice would be to make sure you're only using official materials that can be found from the Prepare page that I linked to a little bit earlier, from the OET shop, from the materials that are available there to purchase that are OET related, or from one of our official OET premium providers that you can find listed on our website, who I said have gone through high degrees of training with OET and who we trust to be able to produce good quality practice materials. This question from YouTube, what types of tasks can we expect for Part A? Will it be a disease condition or something else? So in reading Part A, the types of tasks, types of text, will all be on one topic. And the topic is something that healthcare professionals could be expected to need to refer to this amount of information in one go when treating a patient. So you can see that the examples that are on the website includes things like fractures, includes like the use of nasogastric feeding tubes. It's things that you need to refer to a number of different sources of material to decide the treatment plan, the course of action for the patient. So there's not a list of topics that might be used, but it is the kinds of materials that probably in your working life you're familiar with using when you're treating patients or deciding on the action plans for patients. FTAN is saying, what does question mark pneumonia mean in writing? So when a question mark is provided before a word in the case notes, The meaning of that question mark is possible, suspected, maybe. So it has this meaning of I'm not sure, essentially. So where it says question mark pneumonia, it means possibly pneumonia, suspected pneumonia, maybe pneumonia. And so that's how you would interpret it and how you would then communicate that information in your letter. Vladimir on Facebook says, in urgent referral letters, which part of the letter should we write the action or the request to be done by the reader? And generally, there are two parts of the letter where you might cover the request. So in the introduction, the beginning of your letter, it's normal to mention a very high-level overall reason for writing. So to give them an understanding of your main action point or request for the patient. And then in the final paragraph, you explain those action points or requests in much more detail so that the reader has a clear understanding at the end of the letter exactly what you are requiring of them to do to continue care for the patient. Alphonse on YouTube says, in writing, if you're writing to the patient's own GP, whether we need to write social history. So in terms of including information that the reader might already be familiar with, you certainly wouldn't need to include a lot of detail about the social history. Particularly, you could omit that information if there's absolutely no relevance of that social history to the current condition. If the social history, for example, the patient lives alone or lives in an apartment block, and there's going to be mobility issues with stairs, for example, then you might need to remind the reader or include those details for context, but it would just be very brief as a context rather than including all of the detail in a great amount of words. Kavya on Facebook says, can we write complex sentences in the introduction? Absolutely. You can write complex sentences wherever you feel it's appropriate for your letter. The way that you're being assessed is how you have communicated the information in the case notes to the reader, and you're likely to need a mixture of sentence types, so simple sentences, compound sentences, which combine two ideas together in one sentence, and complex sentences, which also combine two ideas, but in a more complex form, so often with subordinate clauses and other grammar terms that go into that. So absolutely use a complex sentence where you feel it is appropriate. Jisha says on YouTube, is it necessary to complete the tasks which were given in the speaking role play? So on your role card, you'll have roughly 5 or 6 tasks that are there for you to complete in the speaking test with the interlocutor. Now, the reason for providing all of those tasks is to help you to continue speaking for 5 minutes. As I mentioned a little bit earlier with the writing test, we need you to produce sufficient writing to be able to assess you. The same is true for speaking. If you only spoke for 2 minutes, there wouldn't be enough language provided for the assessors to authentically score your speaking. So we need you to continue speaking for the 5 minutes so that the assessors can grade you. And that's why those tasks are there. So you shouldn't run out of content to be able to keep speaking for the 5 minutes. Having said that, it's not absolutely essential for you to complete all of the tasks within the 5 minutes. The priority is having good communication with the interlocutor who's taking the role of your patient. And this will require you to both provide information, but also to listen to what the patient is telling you and to respond to requests from them for information or to negotiate with them if they're unhappy with something that you're recommending. So it isn't absolutely essential for you to complete all of the tasks. Try to manage your time as much as you can and move things forward when you have completed one of the tasks. But don't worry too much if you haven't finished everything by the end of the test. All right, so I'm going to skip forward again a little bit more because so many questions are coming through, and I want to make sure I've answered a good range of them. Sneha on Facebook says, if there are 2 diagnoses in the tasks, then do we need to mention both in the introduction paragraph? With all questions that are similar to this, all I can really advise you is to say it depends on what the reader needs to know. Now, if both of those diagnoses are significant to the reader and will impact how they make a decision about the ongoing treatment of the patient, then I would suggest that yes, they do both need to be mentioned, and probably in the introduction paragraph. However, if only one of those diagnoses is significant to the reader, the other diagnosis is going to be treated by another healthcare professional, then in that case, you probably wouldn't need to include both within the introduction paragraph. The other diagnosis might be mentioned later in your letter. So with all questions relating to what do I include in the letter, make sure you're thinking from the position of the reader, whether the information is relevant to the care the reader is going to provide or not. And that should help you decide whether to include that information or not. I'm seeing a couple of candidates saying that the reading test was too tough. Please make it easy for us. So I covered off a little bit earlier about the reason that the reading test format is the way that it is, and this is based on feedback and requirements that OET has from regulators and employers to make sure that we are testing you on the skills that they value and feel that you will need in their workplaces. So in terms of the level of accuracy required, that again is set by the regulator. They choose what score you need to achieve for them to be happy with your result. It's not something that is set by OET. I would also suggest if, for example, you've been working with official practice materials from the OET website or from the OET shop and you've been finding those materials okay, then you're going to find the test day materials of a similar level of challenge and will perform in a similar way on test day. But again, if you're making use of those unofficial practice materials that are going around on the internet, you're likely to find that the level of challenge there is different, or maybe even the tasks are not very similar to what you will find on test day at all. So it's another reason to be careful about using unofficial materials. Sundaria is saying, in my first test, I scored 330 in speaking. What do I need to get a B grade? Can you please guide me? So for both speaking and writing, if you haven't got the score that you wanted on the first time, my recommendation is to make sure you're really familiar with what the assessors are looking for. Now, that sort of information is provided in the OET masterclasses. We've got short videos for each part of the test that go through the test format, but also what it is that the assessors are looking for and what skills you need to develop. So I'm posting a link to those videos into the comment box now. I'd really recommend having a look at the video for speaking to understand the different assessment criteria the assessors use, and to make sure that you are evidencing all of those things in your speaking test. What we can find with candidates taking OET speaking is, whereas they're used to being assessed on the linguistic criteria, things like their fluency, their pronunciation, their delivery of the information, OET has some additional communication criteria which are linked to being a healthcare professional. Things about how you start the role play, how you demonstrate you're listening to the patient and how you respond to concerns or questions that they ask you, how you organize information when you're providing an explanation. And it's those second set of criteria, there's 5 of them, that I think often candidates are less well prepared for and demonstrate less well in their tests. So it's really worth understanding all of the assessment criteria, but particularly those clinical communication criteria, and doing some work to improve your skills on those. Asgar says, how many types of letter are there in writing? Can you give some details? So for most OET professions, and remember there are 12 different healthcare professionals that can take OET, for most of those professions, there are 3 types of letter that they may be asked to write in their writing test. And those are referral, transfer, and discharge. And those are typical types of information and communication that healthcare professionals will do on a regular basis. And although the way that you perhaps start the letter is slightly different for each of those 3 types of letter, referral, transfer, and discharge, after that, the way that you complete the letter, select information, organize details, is the same for all types of letter. For a few of the OET professions, for example, pharmacy, speech pathology, occupational therapy, there is an additional type of letter that they may be asked to write, and that is an information letter. But unless you're one of those professions, you don't need to worry about that. You are just going to focus on those 3 types of letter that I've just mentioned. Bibi on Facebook says, do we still need to introduce ourselves if the patient knows us during the speaking role play? Good question, and the answer to that is no. This is something that I've just mentioned as one of the speaking criteria. You are being assessed on how you start the conversation, whether it's appropriate for the conversation. And certainly if it's clear from your roll card on the background information that you have met this patient before, or they're one of your regular patients, then it's definitely good to demonstrate to the assessors that you're aware of that and that you have the flexibility to use language to greet someone that you've met before without needing to use introductions. Blessing says, I've heard that OET reading on computer is uncomfortable because one keeps scrolling up and down between the text and the questions. So Blessing, I would recommend that you try a practice reading test on computer for yourself. You can have a go on that from our sample test page. I'll pop the link to that in the comment box now. If you go to the sample test page, at the top of that page, you'll notice there's 2 tabs, one which is open with the sample test for paper, and then a tab next to it which says on computer. So you need to click on that tab on computer to be able to view the computer versions of the test, but then you'll be able to take a practice reading test and try it out for yourself. I've tried it out a few times and I don't feel it's uncomfortable for me. The way that the reading test on computer works is that provided when you're practicing at home, you've set up your computer screen correctly, the computer screen splits in half, and on one half of your screen you will see the texts, and on the other half of the screen you'll see the questions. And you can move those screens independently. So you can move down through the questions while focusing exactly on the text that you want to read. So you can look at them very closely together, which I think is quite handy, particularly to answer reading questions. And it means that you're only looking on the screen where the texts are for a small piece of the text at any one time. So I don't feel it's particularly uncomfortable. Obviously, it's something you need to get used to, and that's why we've got the practice tests available for you to try out and familiarize yourself with. And do please go and try that for yourselves. All right, just having a look for some other questions that I haven't answered yet. So this question from Sobin on YouTube, reading part C, I can't score any questions. Now this suggests a couple of things. One of those things is not going to be very popular with you, Sobin, but it would suggest to me that perhaps you have some weakness in this area and you need to work on your reading skills before you move into taking OET. Now, one easy way that you can check whether you have the language skills that you need yet for OET is to take the OET Pulse test. And this is a very reasonably priced test, which will check your listening skills, reading skills, and use of language skills. And at the end, once you've taken all of the questions, which takes around an hour to complete, you'll be sent a set of results which show you where your skills are on the compared to an OET grade. And potentially, if you were to take that test, you may find that your reading skills are coming out lower than what is required for OET for reading. And in that case, the recommendation is that you probably enroll in some classes to work on your language skills. There can be a number of reasons why you find reading difficulty. It could be that you are very slow at reading. It could be that you need to increase the amount of English vocabulary you have. It could be a number of other things. But if you're not able to score an answer for any of the questions, I would suggest that you do need to work on that as a weakness, and perhaps using the Pulse test to check what your current level of English is for reading would be a good place to start. Merlin has a question on YouTube. Having all the parts of the test together is stressful for our brain. Please, can you arrange it on different days? Merlin, I have sympathy with you for that question. However, it is an answer of logistics and economy and comfort, I'm afraid. I think for most candidates, whereas like you, they might find it preferable to be able to sit different parts of the test on different days. That is pretty complicated. Some candidates are having to travel to be able to take the test. If it was on different days, they'd need to perhaps arrange accommodation to be able to stay. It's also in terms of your results. If the tests were on different days, it would take much longer for us to get your results back to you and so forth. So I do appreciate that it is a big amount of brain power required to complete all of those tests in one go. And stamina is certainly something that I recommend you work on. It is a marathon effort. And if you're someone who is interested in sort of training and exercise, you know that to be able to complete a long distance event, you need to train for it. So you need to be training your brain to be able to work for 3 hours at a time. And the only way to do that is to build up. So perhaps doing some work where you're working on a different part of the test individually, and then maybe once a week you're trying to combine those efforts together to do it one after the other and just train your brain to be able to have the stamina needed on test day. All right, let's have a look for some other questions. Priya says, sometimes OET withholds results. We don't know the reason. We have frustration regarding this. When will it be published? So unfortunately, Priya, if OET has withheld your results, it's because OET has found that there was a problem with your performance on test day, and it's usually down to something called malpractice. So we feel that something about your performance on test day was incorrect. And we will have communicated with you. We will have asked you to submit a statement about your test day experience to explain your performance. But this is part of the security measures that we take. And as I mentioned at the start of the session, we take security and candidate performance absolutely seriously. And any sign of malpractice, of candidates doing the wrong thing in the test, which essentially comes down to cheating, means that those results will be withheld permanently and you won't receive your result for that. So if you have a question relating to malpractice and why your results have been withheld, please do contact OET customer service, and they can provide you with more details about it. I expect you've already received those sorts of details, but understand that, as I said, we take this very, very seriously. And if a candidate's result has been withheld, we feel that there is good reason for doing that. Anwar says, can you please tell me the weekly OET live schedule? So I can look it up for this week that's coming up, but the best way generally to know what the live class schedule is to follow us on Facebook at OET Official. And that will then tell you what events are planned and are coming up. I know at the moment we're publicizing, the next live session, which will be on Thursday from our partners TTM English. And their session is going to be on writing. So some of you were asking earlier about how you can get some more tips on writing. So TTM will be focusing on passive forms in their session on Thursday. Our partners at Swoosh English will also be back on Friday, and their session is going to be on reading part C. And I know a number of you were asking for more support on reading part C. So that's a great opportunity for you to learn some more and tips and skills on that. And then on the 4th of September, which is Saturday, our partners at IRS Group are going to be delivering a session on the speaking test, so how you can clarify and summarize information. So 3 great sessions coming up later this week, and you'll find all the details for those on our Facebook page. Claire is asking, can you use small letters in reading, even if it's a proper noun and brand of medication? So the advice that we give for candidates to complete the reading test is to copy the word or words that you've selected as the answer from one of the texts directly as it is written. So if a capital letter is used in the text, we would just copy it into your answer, and that way you're not making any changes and you don't need to worry about making any mistakes, because in reading part A, your spelling has to be absolutely perfect. Your capitalization isn't particularly assessed, but your spelling is. And so we feel the best way to be accurate with your spelling is to just copy the word or words directly from the text without making any kind of changes to it. If you did write a brand name in small letters, it wouldn't be penalized. The only time I think you might be penalized for not using capitalization is when the answer is an acronym. So for example, COPD or MRI, those are always written in capital letters, and it would be expected, because it's also in the text, that you copy that capitalization into your answer as well. Jacqueline on Facebook says, can you tell us the things we need to bring to the exam? For example, a pencil, eraser, or sharpener. So yes, you definitely need to bring those things for paper-based testing. You might like a pen as well. You can certainly use pen or pencil for most parts of the test. Just pencil is mandatory for reading and listening parts B and C. You'll need to bring your ID with you as well. And you can have a small bottle of water, provided it's clear, there's no writing on the outside of the bottle. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, in terms of a COVID test result, please contact the test venue where you're planning to take OET to find out if that's a requirement from the local government in your area. It could be for your test venue. I don't know that for sure, so please do double check with the test venue. This question from YouTube, I'm writing to request further investigations and a treatment plan for Mr. X. In terms of English, that's a good sentence. As I mentioned earlier in the session, this sentence is good if this is personalized to this particular patient and the requests that you need to make of the reader. So if it says in the writing task to request further investigations and a treatment plan, absolutely you can use it. If it says something different in the writing plan, then I wouldn't use this sentence. I would use the information provided in the writing task to write my introduction. The writing task is really your purpose, your reason for writing. So make use of those words from the writing task to decide how you're going to communicate that in the introduction. Ratna, I can see you're asking several questions that I covered off a little bit earlier. I'm not going to provide any more details in this session about the incident over the weekend, but just to let you know that it doesn't have any impact on future students taking OET. Any students that have been involved in cheating, getting hold of a test paper that they didn't have right to access, will certainly be penalised, and they will hear from OET with information about what those penalties are going to be. Vivian says, in a situation where you don't need to mention all of the medication and you don't know the function of some of the medication, what do you do? Do you include all of them? Vivian, in official OET case notes, it's highly likely that the case notes will make it clear what the function of that medication is. We're not expecting you to guess the function of different medications. So again, as long as you're making use of official practice tasks, and obviously on the test day, those official case notes, that should make it clear which information about the medication you need to include or not. All right, so let's have a look for another question. We're getting into the last sort of 10 minutes now. So here's a question from Hasna. Can we use "it would be highly appreciated" in OET a letter, or just "it would be appreciated"? So Hasna, there hasn't been an update about this. When you're writing a letter to another healthcare professional, we're expecting you to use language that would be suitable and appropriate for the reader. And as you would understand, the things that you're requesting of the reader are very routine, everyday types of requests. So "it would be appreciated" is considered polite and respectful and sufficient when making requests to another healthcare professional. "Highly appreciated" suggests you're asking for something extraordinary or out of the ordinary, something unusual. And in OET terms, I don't believe you're ever going to be asking for something that is that unusual, that "highly appreciated" would be necessary for. So you're unlikely to be penalized for using "highly appreciated," but we're trying to teach you the ways that will be used in your new healthcare career in an English-speaking workplace, and "it would be appreciated" is considered sufficient and respectful. Twinkle says, is it okay to write a patient under your care and also a known case of yours? A patient under your care could be appropriate, although remember that OET is looking at whether you're providing the information concisely, which means don't use more words than necessary to communicate the information. Your patient requires 2 words as opposed to a patient under your care, which requires 5. So I would consider, is that all of those words necessary? Could you write it more succinctly? Yes, you could, by writing "your patient." So I would advise where it's appropriate to use "your patient." We don't recommend a known case of yours. A known case is not a phrase that's really used in Western healthcare settings. It's not seen as particularly respectful to the patient to describe them as a case. So I wouldn't recommend that phrase at all. Hakeem on Facebook, in the OET speaking test, are the interlocutors the same in the role plays, or are they 2 different actors? Hakeem, they are the same. You have the same interlocutor for the whole of your speaking test. And generally an interlocutor is an English teacher rather than an actor. I understand why you use that word, because they are taking a role as a patient, so they are in some ways acting, but they are trained and they are people who have good English skills to be able to complete that part of the test with you. Akila says, can we use although and even though in letter? You can certainly use although when it is an appropriate connector for the sentence that you're writing. We'd recommend using despite as opposed to even though, and certainly to understand that even though is 2 words rather than 1, but we would recommend despite as a more appropriate word for a healthcare letter. Alfreda on Facebook says, writing to a local community nurse, is it a known case or an unknown case? So official OET case notes and your test day case notes will make it clear whether there's an existing relationship between the reader and the patient. So you won't need to guess. By itself, local doesn't mean that the reader and the patient know each other. It just means that they live in the same geographical location. So don't use the word local as meaning of any relationship, but the case notes will make it clear whether you have, whether the reader and the patient know each other already. D says on YouTube, let's say the patient has lots of medication that she's taking. How do I write the medicine list? For example, she might be taking 5 or 6 medications and will be referring to somebody new. So D, even though it's a new patient and they're taking all of these medications, there's a good chance that the reader doesn't need to know all of those medications. Maybe not all of them relate to the reason for referring the patient to this reader. You'll only need to mention a couple of them. You may not need to mention all of the dosage information either. You may just need to mention the type of medication they are taking. So have a think, have a read of those case notes and decide what information do I need to include or not. For official OET case notes, it's very unlikely that you would need to include that many medications in your letter. All right, I'm going to find one last question, and then we will be finishing for this session. And I'll tell you about when the next session is coming up. So let's go right down to the end and see a recent question. This is from Shinsi. Are you going to change the writing criteria? The answer to that is no. I covered this off a little bit earlier in the session. There's no plans to change any parts of OET. The format of the test as it is at the moment is the correct one and the one that we will be using going forward into the future. Thank you for those questions. So if you weren't able to get your question through in time, I'm going to be back in a couple of weeks with another Q&A live session. The next one is going to be on the 13th of September. This will be early in the morning for me here in Australia, but a great time for candidates based in America or perhaps later in the evening in Europe. So do join me for that if you're able to, and I can answer more of your questions then. Also, just to let you know that next week I'm back with another informal live chat. This will be next Thursday. And in these sessions, which are just half an hour long, we talk about how life is going, how we're finding things during COVID restrictions, how vaccination is going in our country, and so forth. So if you're able to join me next Thursday, details of that will be coming up soon on our events page, and I hope to see a number of you there. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been great to answer as many questions as I did. Apologies if I didn't get to your questions. I hope you're keeping safe and keeping well, and I will talk to you all again soon. Thanks then. Bye for now.